Hi everybody and welcome back to TRUDGE, a journey to being recovered. I am your host. My name is Dexter. I am a recovered drug addict alcoholic. Last week we finished with Bill's story as we trudged through the book of Alcoholics Anonymous in the hopes of having you, the viewer, attain a spiritual awakening and have your obsession to drink and drug or whatever it is that you may be struggling with that brought you here removed. I hope everybody's doing well out there. I am doing fantastic. Things are going real well for me. Let's go ahead and open up our book study with the third step prayer, which is what we open up all our book studies for those of you who care to join. It is on page 63 for those of you that do not have it committed to memory at this point. And for those of you who have been following me along this journey thus far the last 3 months, it's going to be highlighted pink. Pink is for prayers. Shall we? God, I offer myself to Thee, to build with me and to do with me as Thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do Thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of Thy power, Thy love, and Thy way of life. And I do Thy will always. So this week, friends, we are at chapter 2 on page 17. We're starting to move into the realm of work in the steps, and the chapter is called There's a Solution. It's a fairly long chapter, 12, 13 pages. I might break it up into 2 or 3 sections depending on how far we get. And let's get started, shall we? It says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous know thousands of men and women who were once just as hopeless as Bill. Bill W., the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. We just read his story last week and the week before that. Nearly all have recovered. Nearly is circled because not all of them have, but most of them have. And the word recovered, anytime we see it in this book, circle it, underline it, recovered. The obsession to drink or use minor mood altering substances has left these people. They have solved the drink problem. We are average Americans. All sections of this country and many of its occupations are represented, as well as many political, economic, social, and religious backgrounds. We are a people who normally would not mix, and that's true for me, I remember going into some of my first meetings, even meetings I go to now, where I think about, I would probably never speak to any of these people otherwise in any other capacity unless we were in this room together. But there exists among us a fellowship, a friendliness, and an understanding which is indescribably wonderful, and that's the truth as well. Many of my closest friends, many of my closest people in my support network today are people that I found in these rooms that, if it weren't for having this illness, I probably would have never come into contact with, so I am very grateful for that. We are like passengers of a great liner, the moment after rescue from shipwreck, when camaraderie, joyousness, and democracy pervade the vessel from steerage to captain's table. Unlike the feelings of the ship's passengers, however, our joy and escape from disaster does not subside as we go our individual ways. This is going to be highlighted orange. It says, the feeling of having shared in a common peril is the one element in the powerful cement which binds us. So that's saying that, the ties that bind us are going to be stronger than those that could tear us apart. We have this common problem, which is why we're all in the rooms. Our drinking problem, our drug problem, our gambling problem, our alcohol, our sex problem, whatever it is, is why we're there. And the truth of the matter is that there is a common solution, and that solution is, having a spiritual awakening at the hands of work in the steps. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we get through this chapter. But that in itself would never have held us together as we are now joined. This next paragraph is going to be POI yellow. For those of you who have done this work with me to this point, this should already be done. And these are the first step promises. So now we're being introduced into the promises that are in this book. And this one says, the tremendous fact for every one of us. And the word fact is underlined. And I have every one of us underlined too. Because it's not just talking to a certain member of the group. It's talking to all of us alcoholics and drug addicts as a whole. Every single one of us. This is a fact. Is that we have discovered a common solution. Now, I have the word common underlined as well. I believe that, a lot of, 12-step programs today aren't about the common solution. We have people who are saying just don't drink and go to meetings, or in some capacities you're here just for today. No matter what, don't pick up. You're not really hearing the common solution that was brought to us by our forefathers, which entailed working the steps, having a spiritual awakening, and then helping others as much as you used to back in the day when the inception of the 12 steps in the Big Book came out. It goes on to say, we have a way out on which we can absolutely agree. The word absolutely is circled. Again, I'm not sure that we absolutely all agree about that. I spent a lot of time in a lot of different fellowships and a lot of different rules for a lot of rooms with a lot of different problems, and I know there was a time where I absolutely didn't agree with, what I heard other people saying. But the truth of the matter is that, after having a spiritual experience as the result of working these steps, I can understand how I absolutely agree with the program that I have worked and continue to work, because it's reconciled within the pages of this book, which was the inception of this program. The spiritual awakening was, it came long before 90 and 90s and treatment centers and men and women were, getting well almost 70, 75 years ago, and so I try to stick to what that is. But again, absolutely, for some people, yes, for some people, no, and upon which we can join in brotherly and harmonious action. This is the great news this book carries from those who suffer from alcoholism or drug addiction or whatever, because I believe this can be the Swiss Army knife for whatever any of your problems are. An illness of this sort, and I have the word illness underlined because that's what it is, man. It's an illness. And we have come to believe it an illness involves those about us in a way no other human sickness can. If a person has cancer, all are to be sorry for him, and no one is angry or hurt. But not so with the alcoholic illness, for with it goes an annihilation of all things worthwhile in life. And it's the truth. Someone has cancer, terminal, testicular, prostate, whatever it is, lymphoma. I mean, everyone's feeling bad for that person. You tell somebody you're an alcoholic, it's treated differently. You're a drug addict, it's treated differently. And I believe that's one of the biggest problems we have, is that people don't really understand it as an illness, and when it starts being treated as one and not as a symptom, I believe is when we're going to start seeing people get well. I think it's absolutely tragic that, drug addicts and alcoholics are seen in the capacity that they are and are viewed the way they are. No one feels bad for someone who's got lupus, but somebody feels bad for someone who's an alcoholic, when I believe that they're both illnesses that, are just as gut-wrenching and heartbreaking in nature. It engulfs all whose lives touch the sufferers, and that's the truth. Anybody who comes into contact with an alcoholic, they're going to suffer at some point if they're of the real variety, maybe even not, for that matter. It brings misunderstanding, fierce resentment, financial insecurity, disgusted friends and employers, warped lives of blameless children, sad wives, and parents. Anyone can increase the list. My list is probably double that. Some people, it could go on and on and on. It could be a scroll like the Declaration of Independence. It's just the dereliction that comes with this disease is just unreal. It really is. We hope this volume will inform and comfort those who are or may be affected. There are many. Highly competent psychiatrists who have dealt with us have found it sometimes impossible to persuade an alcoholic to discuss his situation without reserve. Strangely enough, wives, parents, and intimate friends usually find us even more unapproachable than do the psychiatrist and the doctor. I know for me, I was very unapproachable in my addiction and my alcoholism. It was just really hard. I was a hard person to get through to. It was very difficult for anyone that cared about me to even reach me. This is going to be, I have a star next to this, obviously in italics. It's very, very important, okay? But the ex-problem drinker who has found this solution, and the solution is the steps. That's the solution. Who is properly armed with facts about himself, I have the word facts again circled, can generally win the entire confidence of another alcoholic in a few hours. The word entire is circled. And again, that's that 12-step call, that 12-step service. It doesn't take very long. Ebby brought it to Bill a couple hours later. He was starting to, see things a little bit differently. When Bill and Bob, brought it to Bill Dotson, the same thing. They were able to win over the confidence of these men, in just a short period of time. Until such an understanding is reached, little or nothing can be accomplished. So again, and this, will come up again when we read the chapter called Working with Others, Step 12, that service, of the 12-step variety that these men did early on, and during the creation of this fellowship. They're telling you that until that's met, there's going to be not really very far. The man or woman that is looking for help can go. Sometimes a hospital stay is necessary, a dry out period of rehab so they can be reached. But that connection must be made before they can get to the solution. This is really important. You don't hear a lot of this talked about in meetings today, and it's called the 8 conditions. This next paragraph is going to all be highlighted orange through the next page. And these are the 8 conditions under which we find helping others to be most effective. And it says, the man who is making the approach has had the same difficulty. So I'm drug addict, sex. I have had the same difficulty as you out there, the viewer. I can relate to you, whether it's the specific substance or the feelings of desperation or whatever it is. We can relate to each other. Obviously, he knows what he's talking about. I used to talk about stuff that I knew nothing about. I used to have like PhDs on stuff that I never knew anything about. And today it shows that, I know what I'm talking about. This is important, that the person who is approaching the man or woman looking for help has an understanding of what it is that they're trying to convey. If I'm trying to teach you how to drive stick, I have to be able to know how to drive stick so I can teach you. That his whole deportment shouts at the new prospect that he is a man with a real answer. And that's about being convinced, knowing and not wavering that maybe this kind of works, or if you do this, it might work, but knowing that this works when followed to completion and the steps are taken, that this works. That he has no attitude of holier than thou. I'm no better than you. I'm no worse than you. I walk this path with you. I'm not talking to anybody out there viewing me from some spiritual mountaintop. I'm a real addict. I'm a real alcoholic. I have had these same problems that you probably have had, if not more. I'm just trying to get better every day, and I want to do what I can to help you get better every day. We walk this path together. There is no holier than thou. Nothing whatever except the sincere desire to be helpful. I'm not getting paid to do this. I'm not looking for any accolades, any awards, any medals, any pats on the back. It makes me feel good to know that I'm helping other people. And by doing so, I get to stay recovered. It's a win-win. It's like the paradox of, keeping what I have by giving it away. I just really want to be of help. Our literature says that our only aim is to be of help. I believe it's on page 91 or 92. That program of altruism that Bill Dotson, Ebby Thatcher, Rowan, Hazard, all these earlier forefathers, brought to the table to help create this great program. We just want to be helpful to those who want it. That there are no fees to pay. Again, I'm not sending anybody a check, or waiting to receive one. There are no fees to pay. There's no basket that's going around in computer world here. I'm doing this because I love to do it, and I'm hoping that somebody will one day get something out of it the way I got something out of it when my sponsor worked with me. No access to grind. I got no beefs with anyone out there. If anything, I think, being able to use electronics in this capacity is one of the greatest gifts ever. So why not do it? I'm not trying to, get at someone else by doing this. I ain't got, no beefs with anyone else, that wants to do it, doesn't want. It's none of that. We're free from that. No people to please. I don't please people today. I do this because it makes me feel good. I get to stay recovered, and I believe this is what God's will is for me. No lectures to be endured. This could be kind of tricky. I don't like to lecture people. I don't try to come off as a lecture. Sometimes I can get long-winded. And I know sometimes, as a sponsor, we can all kind of maybe get that way. We're trying to convey points. But again, I'm no one's dad. I'm no one's boyfriend in here. I'm just trying to get points across. But that's a tricky one. Even, sometimes I have to kind of, I go off on a tangent. I kind of got to curtail that and watch that. We're not here to lecture people. If we're doing this, more than likely we're grown. These are the 8 conditions which we have found most effective. So my experience has been, it's like if someone wants to get something from you in the way of 12-step work, I want you to sponsor them, I want you to help them, along with the chapter called Working with Others, I always look here and ask myself, am I able to bring these 8 conditions to the table? And if I can, I'm more than likely in a good position to be of service to another man or woman in this 12-step capacity, especially taking them through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I have the words most effective circled. There are other things that you can do to be effective here, but these are going to be the 8 conditions that are going to be most effective, and the whole 8 conditions from page 18 to 19 are highlighted orange. After such an approach, many take up their beds and walk again, like Bill D. left the hospital. Bill and Bob, they brought the 8 conditions to him. He never had another drink, and there have been millions of stories like this about men and women who have gotten well and stayed well as the result of getting the help that they needed, for men and women who brought these 8 conditions to them and accepting the program of action that was laid out in this book, or laid out from the first 6 steps that were brought to AAA from the Oxford groups, and then we developed them into our own 12. This is going to be highlighted orange. It's very important as well. It says, none of us makes a sole vocation of this work, nor do we think its effectiveness would be increased if we did. We feel that elimination of our drinking is but a beginning. So that's all highlighted orange. I have the last part of it. We feel that elimination of our drinking is but a beginning. I have that underlined. And the words but a beginning I have circled. So we're not telling anyone that, this is the only way to do it. Because it's not. This is what has worked for me and hopeless drug addicts and alcoholics throughout history. But I know people who have gone to church, never drank again. I've done sweat lodges, never drank, never used again. Their problems have been arrested. That stuff didn't work for me, So we don't think that, we're going to make this any more effective if we run around telling people that this is the only way to do it. If that worked for you, great. That wasn't my story. That wasn't Bill's story. That wasn't the story of thousands, millions, of alcoholics and drug addicts throughout history. We had to work some steps. It also goes on to say that we feel that elimination of our drinking is but a beginning. Well, what is that saying? Because many of us, we get to the rooms and all we want to do is stop drinking. All we want to do is stop drugging. All we want to do is stop the behavior that was causing us so much pain. That was my story. But the truth of the matter is without any steps and just being dry, my disease it manifested itself in so many different other ways that I didn't even see it happening as it was going on until it was causing me pain the same way as the substance that I tried to put down in the beginning was, and it's telling you that it's just the start. In order to take the journey, to work the steps, the goal of getting towards a spiritual awakening, having that psychic change take place, the drinking or the drugging or whatever it is, that's just a precursor. That's just to get started. Now, many people, their goal is to just not drink. They get that, or just not drug. They get to that, and they're happy with that. That was me for a long time. I was happy with that, but I never knew happiness the way I know it now because I never worked steps. I chose to pick and choose the parts of the program that I wanted to work, and I never had a spiritual awakening. And the truth of the matter is, it's only by God's grace that I never relapsed. That's just my story. That's not the story of some people. But I was in quite a bit of pain when I decided that, I was bottoming out in the rooms and I needed to do something. And, I'm grateful that the teacher was there to show me how to take the steps. And so this is what I'm doing to try to help you, the viewer, get to that point where you have a spiritual awakening. Because, again, it says this several places in this book that drinking is just the start. A much more demonstration of our principles, the words principles are underlined, lies before us in our respective homes, occupations, and affairs. The steps culminate with the words in all our affairs. It's not just about not drinking and drugging. It's saying, how are you acting when you're at home, at work, out in the street? A big barometer for me of my program is, how am I acting when I drive, when I'm dealing with the public in customer service? How am I doing there? In all our affairs. The next 3 words, all of us. Those words are circled. All of us. It doesn't get specific about this group of alcoholics or this group of drug. It says all of us. All of us spend. And this is going to be highlighted orange the rest of this sentence. Much of our time in the sort of effort which we are going to describe. Okay, so we're setting you up here to understand what kind of behaviors these alcoholic people went through that are very similar to many of the ones that you and I have gone through. A few are fortunate enough to be so situated that they can give nearly all their time to the work. I'm not one of those people. I know very few people who do. I work, I have a kid, I have a girlfriend, I'm very busy in sponsorship. I have all types of other outside things that I do. I just can't do that all the time. For me, this is kind of an avocation. If we keep on the way we are going, there's little doubt that much good will result. But the surface of the problem would hardly be scratched. Those of us who live in large cities are overcome by the reflection that close by hundreds are dropping into oblivion every day. And that's true. I live in a small town now, but I used to come from a big city, and, I would go to meetings where there would be 200 people. Here meetings are more like 20, 30 people. Many could recover if they had the opportunity we have enjoyed. How then shall we present that which has been so freely given to us? We have concluded to publish an anonymous volume setting forth the problem as we see it. Okay, so now they're talking about the big book. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in the room where these men and women were talking about creating this program and what they were going to put into this book. Okay, and so now they're bringing to us, the reader, the problem as they saw it. We shall bring to the task our combined experience and knowledge. I have experience and knowledge underlined. You can't help anybody without those two things. Remember, from the doctor's opinion, the thing that has to hold these alcoholic people is, it has to be grounded in a power greater than themselves. And what I'm telling you has to have depth and weight, experience and solution. Without those two things, I can't help you. And if you don't have those things, who are you going to help? That's just how it is. We have to have those in order to be productive and to actually get somewhere. This should suggest a useful program for anyone concerned with a drinking problem. And again, drug problem, alcohol problem, sex problem, whatever it is, I believe that this book can be the steps that are in this book, when followed, can be the solution to any problem that you may have. It says on page 42, quite as important was the discovery that spiritual principles will solve all my problems, and it's not just something that I read in a book, and I struggled with a lot of these things that I no longer struggle with, the obsession to act out in those behaviors in that manner, that was removed, just like my alcoholism. It's been a wonderful journey. This should suggest a useful program for anyone concerned with a drinking problem or any problem. Of necessity, there will have to be discussion of matters medical, psychiatric, social, and religious. We are aware that these matters are, from their very nature, controversial. Nothing would please us so much as to write a book which would contain no basis for contention or argument. It would be great, but we know that's, how hard is it to do that? With everyone's opinions and backgrounds and religious, things, it's just very difficult to do. It goes on to say, we shall do our utmost to achieve that ideal. The next sentence is going to be highlighted orange through the next page. It says, most of us sense that real tolerance of other people's shortcomings and viewpoints, and a respect, the word respect is circled, for their opinions and attitudes which make us more useful to others. This is one of my very, 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 very favorite parts of the book. It says, our very lives as ex-problem drinkers, it depends on the constant thought of others and what we can do to meet their needs. Constant. Okay, so all that's highlighted orange. That's deep. Because our meetings are made up of people from all over the place. Religious backgrounds, different opinions of how to work this program, things they've done, places they've been, what they've drank, what they've shot, who they've been with. It's all different. We are who we are. And to have the real tolerance of other people's shortcomings and a respect for their opinions or attitudes, that's what makes us more useful. If I just decide that I was going to only work with people of color, that would be taking away from the message that I have to give. Or only work with people who are Catholic, that would be alienating groups of people that would be so willing to get this gift. We have to be patient, tolerant, kind, and loving to all people and share freely to anyone who wants this. And then it tells us our very lives as ex-problem drinkers or drug addicts or whatever. It depends on the constant thought of others and what I can do to meet their needs, So it's like, today's my day off. Mondays are my day off, I could be doing anything today. Sure, I got the laundry. I got to eat. I got to do this. I got to do that. I got to do this. But what the bottom line is, like, I'm thinking about doing this. This is like my priority, is making sure I get this video up for you guys and make sure that I can articulate it in a way that you can understand. That's like my biggest goal today. That's my priority. By doing so, I get to stay recovered, and I follow the program of altruism that our forefathers so eloquently did. So the next paragraph is also going to be highlighted orange. It says, you may have already asked yourself, and this is POI orange for those of you who have been following this from day one. You've already asked yourself why it is that all of us, and all of us is circled, because, the book is speaking to all of us, became so very ill from drinking, and we all did. Some of us got more ill than others, but we all did. Doubtless you are curious to discover in the how and why, in the face of expert opinion to the contrary. And this next sentence, along with being highlighted orange, is going to be underlined. We have recovered. The word recovered is circled. From a hopeless condition of mind and body. Have mind and body circled as well. A little bit of the doctor's opinion being sprinkled in there. Okay? The phenomenon of craving, coupled with the obsession of the mind. We have recovered from that. If you are an alcoholic who wants to get over it, or a drug addict who wants to get over it, whatever you are, you want to get over it, you want to stop that behavior, you want it gone, you may be already asking, what do I have to do? And when I came to my sponsor, I was ready. I would have done anything. I remember saying, well, what do I have to do? And if you have somebody that's at that point and they're willing to go to any lengths, then they're ready. They're ready to take these steps as we, so, meticulously written out in how it works on page 58. Then they're ready. It is the purpose of this book to answer such questions specifically. The word purpose, underlined. The word specifically, underlined. Okay, it's telling you what the book's there for, and it tells you that we're not just going to answer, but we're going to be specific about it. We're going to get to the whole, of it. Root, tooth, nail, we are answering these questions, okay? We shall tell you what we have done. Before going into a detailed discussion, it may be well to summarize some points as we see them. How many times have people said to us, I can take it or leave it alone? Why can't he? Why don't you drink like a gentleman or quit? That fellow can't handle his liquor. Why don't you try beer and wine? Lay off the hard stuff. His willpower must be weak. He could stop if he wanted to. She's such a sweet girl. I should think he'd stop for her sake. The doctor told him that if he ever drank, again, it would kill him. But there he is, all lit up again, and that's just, I believe, people being ignorant or really not understanding what alcoholism is. A real alcoholic has no control or choice. A real drug addict is going to use. They can't make that decision to start or stop. And once that's in, they have no control. This next paragraph is going to be highlighted orange. It says, now these are commonplace observations on drinkers, which we hear all the time. Back of them is a world of ignorance and misunderstanding. Just like I said, people they have these conceptions of what it is. And the bottom line is they really don't understand the disease. We see that these expressions refer to people whose reactions are very much different than ours. Moderate drinkers, and see, this is a really important part of the work before I get into it. So this chapter, Bill W., he wants you to make the distinction. We're going to talk about the moderate drinker. We're going to talk about the hard drinker. We're going to talk about the real alcoholic, because if you're a weekend warrior, if you can take it or leave it, dude, you're not one of us. And you don't need to have a spiritual experience, to have this problem arrested and removed, that obsession removed. If you're a hard drinker, you don't need to have that. Oprah, Dr. Phil, your therapist, group therapy, quantum touch healing, psychotherapy, all types of different things. The church, that might be able to help you. But if you are the real alcoholic, where control and choice come into mind, there's virtually no other answer, And so Bill wants you to make the distinction here. We're going to break down the types of alcoholics. Bottom of page 20. Moderate drinkers have little trouble giving up liquor entirely if they have good reason for it. They can take it or leave it alone. Same thing with drugs. Same thing with whatever it is. Okay? They can take it or leave it alone. Then we have a certain type of hard drinker. He may have had the habit badly enough to gradually impair himself physically and mentally. It may cause him to die a few years before his time. If a sufficiently strong reason, ill health, falling in love, change of environment, or warning of a doctor becomes operative, this man can also stop. Stop. So the word stop's going to be circled. You guys know what stop means? A person can stop. Or moderate, although he may find it difficult and troublesome and may even need medical attention. So you can go from a moderate drinker to a hard drinker, and you can go from a hard drinker to a real alcoholic. It can just progress, okay? Next sentence. But what about the real alcoholic? Now, mind you, people, we're not here trying to make light or conscious separation of people in groups. You know, you're not a real alcoholic. You shouldn't be here. You're only a hard drinker. You don't need this. That's not what we're trying to. We're not trying to separate people, class people. Bill wants you to make the distinction. You know, we want to know if that's what you are, because if you are not a real alcoholic, there are ways and means for you to get well besides having a spiritual awakening. Okay? But what about the real alcoholic? He may start off as a moderate drinker. He may or may not become a continuous hard drinker. And I have the rest of this underlined. But at some stage of his drinking career, he begins to lose all control of his liquor consumption once he starts to drink. The word drink is circled, and then I have written after that sex, food, drugs, gambling. I will clearly be able to remember every single one of those where I cross that line from losing control around those issues. It doesn't just have to be alcohol. I understand the single-minded focus of this program was people who had alcoholism, you know, chronic, hopeless alcoholism. But believe me when I tell you, this can work for anything. I've seen it happen to other people, and it's happened in my own life. It goes on to say, here's the fellow who has been puzzling you, especially in his lack of control. That word control, circled. That's what we're talking about here. Control and choice. He does absurd, incredible, tragic things while drinking. He is a real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That's who I was. He is seldom mildly intoxicated. He's always more or less insanely drunk, insanely high, insanely, acting out. His disposition while drinking resembles his normal nature, but little. So, they're telling you, you're almost like two different people, when you're on the sauce and when you're not. He may be one of the finest fellows in the world. You don't have to be a Skid Row bum. You could be three-piece suit Johnny out there, head of a corporation making millions. The Skid Row of success is equally as damaging here. And that's a misconception I think a lot of people have. It's one that I had, coming from the suburbs of Long Island, New York, thinking that, there was only a certain kind of person that could be an alcoholic and a drug addict. That couldn't be any more further from the truth. Yet, let him drink for a day, and he frequently becomes disgustingly and even dangerously antisocial. I mean, at the end, I was alone at home with the shades drawn. I didn't want to talk to anybody. He has a positive genius for getting tight at exactly the wrong moment, particularly when some important decision or decision must be made or engagement kept. And the word tight just means another word of saying drunk. That's like the late 1930s way of saying drunk. This is going to be highlighted orange. I have stars around this. It says, he is often perfectly sensible and well-balanced concerning everything except liquor. But in that respect, he is incredibly dishonest and selfish. And that was the story of my life. Paid my rent, took a shower, shaved, was clean, out there paying my bills, working hard, never late, but when it came to drinking and drugging, dude, all that stuff went out the window. It was a completely different person. And this is how a lot of us are. A lot of us are. He often possesses special abilities, skills, and aptitudes, and has a promising career ahead of them. He uses his gifts to build up a bright outlook for his family and himself, and then pulls the structure down on his head by a senseless series of sprees. And the word sprees, we're going to go ahead and circle that. We all know what a spree is. Some people call it a run. Some people call it being out there. A spree, putting together hours, days of, just debauchery around the substance. I've had several of them. He is the fellow who goes to bed so intoxicated he ought to sleep the clock around. Yet early the next morning he searches madly for the bottle he misplaced the night before. If he can afford it, he may have liquor concealed all over his house, to be certain no one gets his entire supply away from him or to throw down the waste pipe. I used to hide drugs all over the house. Months after I cleaned up, I'd still be finding little stashes that I had forgotten that I'd put there. This is the mindset. That obsession of not wanting to run out, that needing to have it, the control, no choice. You gotta have it. These are the things that we as drug addicts and alcoholics do. POI orange, for those of you who have been doing this work with me, it says, highlighted orange, as matters grow worse, he begins to use a combination of high-powered sedative and liquor to quiet his nerves so he can go to work. The word high-powered, those words are going to be underlined. Then comes the day when he simply cannot make it and gets drunk all over again. Perhaps he goes to a doctor who gives him morphine, which is just a drug, for those people that think that this is just about alcohol. There's drugs in this book. He gets morphine and some sedative with which to taper off. Then he begins to appear at hospitals and sanitariums. This combination was the same combination that plagued Bill W., Dr. Bob, me, millions of us before we had done the work and become recovered from this disease. This is about alcoholism, but there's drugs in this book too. And the bottom line, it's about anything that you need it to be about. This, again, can be the hand of God via the 12 steps. They can solve any problems that you're going to have, especially with mind and mood altering substances. So this is the best example of cross addiction in the whole basic text. There is by no means a comprehensive picture of the true alcoholic, as our behavior patterns vary. So there's never going to be, you can point to that guy and say, well, yeah, I'm supposed to look like him. No. Okay? It varies, Again, you have the Skid Row guy, you have the corporate guy, you have your laid back, tree hugger. I mean, we come in so many different, we're like Baskin Robbins, man. We come in so many different flavors and fares. You just can't tell any of us on earth, could fall subject to drug addiction and alcoholism. It doesn't have to have a certain look to it. But this description should identify him roughly. Why does he behave like this? If hundreds of experiences have shown him that one drink means another debacle, and with all its attendant suffering and humiliation, why is it that he takes that one drink? Because he's an alcoholic. That's why. A real alcoholic has no control, has no choice. He's going to take that drink. You might be able to arrest that disease today, but without a spiritual awakening, a week, 2 months, 3 years, 25 years, you're going to pick up again. That's been the bitter experience of millions of people, and a lot of the stories that are going to be read in this book, two in particular, are in the next chapter called More About Alcoholism. Why can't he stay on the water wagon? What has become of the common sense and willpower that he still sometimes displays with respect to other matters? Perhaps there will never be a full answer to these questions. Opinions vary considerably as to why the alcoholic reacts differently from normal people. We are not sure why, once a certain point is reached, little can be done for him. We cannot answer the riddle. There's just no answer to that. We know that while the alcoholic keeps away from drink, as he may do so for months or years, he reacts much like other men. We are equally positive that once he takes any alcohol, whatever, into his system, something happens, both bodily and mental sense. Bodily and mental sense are going to be underlined. That's, again, a little bit of sprinkling the doctor's opinion into this chapter. The obsession of the mind, coupled with the phenomenon of craving, gets kicked. That allergy happens, and that's triggered, and boom. It makes it virtually impossible for him to stop. Even when he wants to, even when she wants to. Once that allergy is triggered, there's nothing they can do. The experience of any alcoholic will abundantly confirm this. These observations would be academic and pointless if our friend never took the first drink, thereby setting this terrible cycle in motion. This is going to be highlighted orange. This sentence says, therefore, the main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than his body. The word mind is circled. So, we think it, and then we do it, and then the allergy kicks in, and the phenomenon of craving takes place, and then the body wants it. The obsession of the mind keeps going back, and it's like a tennis match. Body versus the mind versus the body versus the mind. If you ask him why he started on that last bender, the chances are he will offer you one of 100 alibis. Sometimes these excuses have a certain plausibility, but none of them really make sense in the light of the havoc an alcoholic's drinking bout creates. They sound like the philosophy of the man who, having a headache, beats himself on the head with a hammer so that he can't feel the ache. This is going to be highlighted orange. It says, if you draw this fallacious reasoning to the attention of the alcoholic, he will laugh it off or become irritated and refuse to talk. Once in a while, he may tell the truth. And the truth, strange to say, is usually that he has no more idea why he took that first drink than you have. Some drinkers have excuses with which they are satisfied part of the time. The next sentence is going to be underlined. It says, but in their hearts, they really do not know why they do it. Once the malady has a real hold, they are a baffled lot. The word malady is circled from the spiritual malady, the very first point of interest we ever did in Trudge on page 52. That's once that spiritual malady has a hold on you, you're in trouble. You're in big trouble. There's an obsession that somehow, someday, they will beat the game. But they often suspect they are down for the count. How true this is, few realize. In a vague way, their families and friends sense that these drinkers are abnormal, but everyone hopefully awaits the day when the sufferer will rouse himself from his lethargy and assert his power of will. And we know, those of us real alcoholics and drug addicts who have recovered from this disease know that there'll never come a day where our willpower will be stronger than this disease. We might be able to keep it at bay for now, but in the long run, as life continues to happen, the day is going to come that without a spiritual awakening that we are going to pick up. If we happen to be one of those people that slips under the cracks, how happy were we really during that time of abstinence? To me, abstinence is simply treading water. And so we have another 6 pages to go. I think this is a good stopping point for Trudge this week. Again, my name is Dexter. I'm a recovered drug addict alcoholic. Thank you for allowing me to serve. I am going on vacation, so I will not have another submission of Trudge out for 2 weeks. But the next submission will entail the second half of the chapter, There's a Solution. And just kind of looking at it, there's like so much more, highlighting and stuff's going to be a lot more than what we've been doing to this point now. And we're going to talk a little bit about Roland Hazard and, and what he went through. And we're going to start talking a little bit more about the steps and establishing a relationship with God. Following that is more about alcoholism. And, we're going to really start moving into the steps after that. So, again, I hope everybody's well. It's very important to go over the work. I know I'm just kind of flying through it because I'm here looking at a screen and I don't have another human being in front of me. But reviewing the work and applying it into your day-to-day, absolutely makes a lot of sense. I know some people I've worked with to this point are like, well, when do we get into the steps? When do we get into the steps? We're doing this, we're doing that. You got me watching this movie, listening to this speaker. We're doing all this Cliff Notes type, stuff. What's going on? It's coming. I'm a very firm believer that in order to know where you're going, you need to know where you come from. I think the history is of paramount importance, and hearing exactly what it is that these men and women did and put in this book so we can get a better understanding of how to have a spiritual experience. It can't be glossed over with a minimum of concern, not for a second. And so that's kind of where we're at. We're a little bit about 45 minutes today. And I hope everybody, again, is starting to feel a little bit different and feeling good about themselves. Hopefully you have sponsors that are helping you in this capacity. And just remember that no matter what, relying on God and not on others is definitely, the way to go, and trusting God, cleaning house, helping others, making sure you pay attention and making sure you pay it forward. I can't stress how important it is to help others, I believe a person with 1 day clean can help a person with no days. A person with 1 day sober can teach a person, something about who's got no days, something about how they ended up getting that day. It always doesn't have to be in a 12-step variety capacity, but what we're doing here with the work is that you absolutely, to keep it, and to stay. That permanent recovery that the book talks about, nothing ensures it, like one alcoholic working with another, one drug addict working with another. And so that's all. I'm out of gas and I'm thirsty. Thanks again for allowing me to serve you guys. It really is a pleasure. I really enjoy doing this. And until such time, be well and take care. Namaste.